Winter is not a season in Russia. It is a weapon, and it has destroyed more invading armies than any general the country has ever produced. 5 times, foreign powers marched into Russia certain of victory, certain their army was too strong, too modern, too disciplined to fail where others had. Every single time, the land itself finished what the Russian army started. This is the story of 5 invasions that entered Russia as conquerors and left as ruins, counting down from bad to catastrophic. Number 5. The year is 1610. Russia has no true Tsar. Famine has already killed perhaps a third of the population in some regions, and desperate rumors of cannibalism spread through starving villages. Into this chaos rides a Polish army, invited in by Russian nobles who see a Polish prince as their best hope of restoring order. Polish soldiers marched straight into the Kremlin itself and occupied the seat of Russian power, something no foreign army had ever managed before. For 2 years, Poland effectively rules Moscow from behind its own walls. But outside the capital, an ordinary merchant named Kuzma Minin stands in a marketplace in Nizhny Novgorod and does something no nobleman had managed to do. He convinces ordinary Russians, shopkeepers and farmers, to hand over their own money and jewelry to fund an army of liberation. Alongside a wounded prince named Dmitry Pozharsky, Minin raises a volunteer force from nothing and marches on Moscow. By October 1612, the Polish garrison inside the Kremlin is so completely cut off and starving that soldiers reportedly resort to eating the bodies of their own dead before finally surrendering. Poland's occupation of Russia, the first and only time a foreign power ever controlled the Kremlin, collapsed at the hands of a merchant and a wounded prince, not a professional army. A nation with no Tsar had still found a way to expel an invader from its own capital. A century later, one of Europe's most feared conquerors would learn the same lesson somewhere much colder. Number 4. In the winter of 1708, King Charles XII of Sweden, a battlefield genius who has never lost a major engagement, leads his army deep into Russian territory, convinced he can end the war in a single decisive strike. He gambles wrong. The Russians, under Peter the Great, refuse to give him the battle he wants, instead burning every village, every granary, every scrap of food in his path as they retreat, leaving nothing for the Swedish army to live on. That winter turns out to be one of the coldest of the entire century. Near the village of Hadiak, hundreds of Swedish soldiers simply freeze to death overnight standing at their posts. By the time Charles finally corners what he believes is a beatable Russian force outside the fortress town of Poltava the following July, his army has shrunk from over 40,000 men to barely 17,000, badly supplied and low on gunpowder. Charles himself is carried onto the battlefield on a stretcher, wounded in the foot days earlier and unable to walk. The battle lasts a matter of hours. Nearly 7,000 Swedish soldiers lie dead by the time it ends, and thousands more are captured within days as the remnants of Charles's army are run down at the Dnieper River, forced to surrender without their own king, who had already fled south with barely 500 men left at his side. The empire Sweden had spent a century building never recovered. Charles spent years afterward as a guest and effectively a prisoner of the Ottoman Sultan, still dreaming of a war he had already lost. Sweden's great power status died in a single afternoon outside Poltava. 2 centuries later, a newly reborn nation would try marching into Russia from the opposite direction with almost the exact same result. Number 3. In the summer of 1920, a newly independent Poland, barely 2 years old, sees an opportunity in a Soviet Russia still exhausted and reeling from its own revolution and civil war. Polish forces push deep into Soviet territory, and for a moment it looks as though history might simply repeat itself in reverse, with the Bolshevik government itself at risk of collapse. Soviet leaders, sensing weakness, push back hard, driving Polish forces into retreat and advancing all the way to the outskirts of Moscow itself by August, convinced they were about to spread revolution straight into the heart of Europe. Polish commanders, reading intercepted Soviet radio communications, spot a gap forming between 2 advancing Soviet armies and gamble everything on a single desperate counterattack aimed straight at that gap. It works. Soviet forces, expecting to be encircling a beaten enemy, instead find themselves the ones being surrounded. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers are killed or captured within days in what Polish history still called the Miracle on the Vistula, a battle many historians consider one of the most decisive of the 20th century, one that stopped the westward spread of the Soviet Revolution in its tracks for a generation. Even a battered, exhausted Poland had managed to turn back an invasion aimed straight at its capital. What happened when the largest army ever assembled in human history tried the exact same thing 12 years later is almost impossible to describe in ordinary terms. Number 2. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crosses into Russian territory with more than 600,000 men, the single largest invasion force Europe has ever seen assembled in one place, confident that a single decisive battle will force the Tsar to submit within weeks. The Russian army refuses to fight him directly, retreating for hundreds of miles and burning the countryside behind them exactly as their ancestors had against the Swedes a century earlier, leaving Napoleon's soldiers marching through a landscape of ash and empty wells. At Borodino in September, the two armies finally clash in a single day of fighting so brutal that tens of thousands of men fall on both sides before nightfall, and yet even that carnage produces no clear victor and no surrender. When Napoleon finally reaches Moscow days later, he finds the city almost completely empty, its streets silent, and within hours of his arrival, fires break out across it, apparently set deliberately by its own retreating citizens, destroying the food and shelter his army desperately needs. Napoleon waits 35 days inside the burned ruins for a surrender that never comes, expecting Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. Alexander refuses to even respond to his letters, reportedly declaring he'd rather beg in Siberia than negotiate with an invader still standing on Russian soil. By the time Napoleon finally orders the retreat in October, winter has already begun closing in, and the countryside his own army had marched through on the way in has nothing left to offer on the way back out. Starving, freezing, and harassed constantly by Cossack cavalry striking from the tree line at dawn and vanishing before anyone could return fire, the Grande Armée disintegrates during the retreat. Thousands drown or freeze trying to cross the Dnieper River under fire, the ice cracking under the combined weight of desperate men, horses, and wagons, the screams of those going under lost in the noise of artillery from both banks. Of more than 600,000 soldiers who marched into Russia that summer, only around 100,000 stagger back out, many of them frostbitten, half-starved, and unrecognizable as the same army that had crossed the border with such confidence. Napoleon's aura of invincibility, built over more than a decade of victories across Europe, never fully recovers. And yet, even that unthinkable disaster is dwarfed by what happened the next time an army tried to conquer Russia by force, less than 130 years later. Number 1. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launches the largest land invasion in human history, sending more than 3 million soldiers across a nearly 2,000-mile front in a surprise assault codenamed Operation Barbarossa, aimed at destroying the Soviet Union in a matter of months before the harvest even came in. The opening weeks are catastrophic for the Soviets, with entire armies encircled and captured in vast pockets. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners marched west into camps where many will starve to death before the war even reaches its first winter. German tanks push forward faster than almost anyone believed possible, forcing to within sight of Moscow's outer suburbs by December, close enough for advanced scouts to reportedly glimpse the towers of the Kremlin through field binoculars on a clear day. But the same brutal Russian winter that broke Charles XII and Napoleon arrives again, catching German forces without proper winter clothing or equipment, their engines freezing solid overnight, their rifles jamming in the extreme cold, their advance grinding to a complete halt just miles from their objective. A Soviet counteroffensive launched in the depths of that same winter with fresh troops brought in from Siberia pushes German forces back from the capital for the first time since the invasion began, catching an exhausted, frostbitten army that had never planned to still be fighting in the snow. By the time the fighting on the Eastern Front finally ends in 1945, Germany has suffered casualties that dwarf every previous invasion of Russia combined, with the opening campaign alone costing over 775,000 German casualties before the war had even reached its first anniversary. The wider war on the Eastern Front would go on to become by a wide margin the deadliest military conflict in human history, costing millions of lives on both sides before it finally ended in the ruins of Berlin itself. Less than 4 years after German soldiers had first crossed the border, certain the whole campaign would be over before the snow ever fell. 5 invasions, 5 different centuries, 5 different armies that each believed their own moment would finally be the exception. Polish nobles who thought a crown could hold a nation, a Swedish king who had never lost a war until the one that mattered most, a Polish republic that turned an invasion around by inches, an emperor who thought burning a city would break a country's will instead of hardening it, and an army that came within sight of its final target before the cold and the distance finished what the fighting alone couldn't. Every one of them had superior tactics, superior technology for their era, or overwhelming numbers on their side. None of it mattered nearly as much as the sheer brutal scale of the country itself and the willingness of the people inside it to burn everything they owned rather than hand it over intact. If this video pulled you in and didn't let go, hit like. That's the clearest way to tell us history like this deserves more of our time and yours. If you know someone who needs to feel what it was like standing in that snow, send us their way. That's genuinely how a small channel like ours finds new people. And down in the comments, tell us which of these 5 moments hit you hardest, or which historical disaster you think deserves this same treatment next. We read every comment, and they shape exactly what gets made.